Hey, what's up, guys? It's next time. We've been playing Pikmin 1, 2, and 3, and I gotta tell you that Pikmin has a special place in my heart. My wife has gone out and bought me every Pikmin game, and even went as far as to buy me a Wii U just so that I could play Pikmin 3. I really like the games, but the more I think about them, the more I realize that Pikmin 1 has something special that doesn't really fit into Nintendo's business model. And because Pikmin 1 has this problem, is why with every subsequent game, Nintendo tweaks and tunes things in an attempt to move and mold Pikmin to fit into their business model better. This is all well and good, for Nintendo, but in my opinion, they're trading away what make Pikmin 1 special. In this video, I'll be going through the elements that make up Pikmin 1, 2, and 3, and I'll explain how they compare with each other so you can get a clear picture as to why, at least in my opinion, Pikmin 1 has no true successor. This is your spoiler warning. After this point, Pikmin 1, 2, and 3 are fair game. If you haven't played any of the games, I recommend Pikmin 1. It's the shortest of the bunch, but in my opinion, it's the best one in the series. 2 has the most content, and 3 has the most polish. If you could be picky, I recommend Pikmin 1 for the Wii. It had some big quality of life improvements that are seriously missing in the GameCube version. So, to compare apples to apples, let's break down some key elements that make up Pikmin 1 to see how each individual game stacks up against the original. I won't be going through the entirety of the game, meaning I won't be going through like graphics, sound effects, music, or game design. In this video, I want to focus strictly on what I believe makes Pikmin 1 unique. And the three topics I feel are most important to that goal are the story, the Pikmin themselves, and how the day and night cycle is handled. Everything else in the game has been largely kept intact. The sound effects are mostly the same, the game design is mostly intact. Really, to me, it's these three things story, Pikmin, and day cycle that I find got the most change done to them, which is why I think they're the best at describing why Pikmin 1 is so different from the rest. So, the first element we're going to be looking at for Pikmin 1 is story, which, arguably is the strongest piece that makes Pikmin 1 so special. Pikmin 1's story is dark, like they don't spell it out for you because it's Nintendo and it's a kids game, but it's not something that we have to research or pull a game theory in order to get. The pieces aren't hiding. We just have to string them together. Let me quickly go through the start of the game so that we can all be on the same page when looking at the story. The game starts you off with Olimar crash landing onto a planet, right? He meets his first red Pikmin, and he pieces together that he needs to use the Pikmin to help him rebuild the spaceship so that he can get back home. Olimar's motivation is clear from day one. He just wants to get back home, and he needs the Pikmin to do it. He also has to do it while under the threat of a metaphorical gun. Oliver needs to rebuild his spaceship, or he risks suffocating to death in 30 days. You might have missed it, but in the first day, Oliver refers to these Pikmin as childlike, that they're as curious as children. In case you don't know, Oliver is a family man. It's whatever. He's probably missing his kids, and that's what's happening on day one. But as you continue to play, the game hits you with this. Olimar has a journal entry describing an incident that happened with a bomb rock and a yellow Pikmin. In case you forgot, yellow Pikmin in Pikmin 1 are the only ones who can carry bomb rocks in the game. Well, apparently, one Pikmin miscalculated and accidentally blew himself up. Olimar kinda describes the poor Pikmin's final moments in detail, remembering its scared face, how it stared at him in its final moments, and that the Pikmin's scared face is seared into his mind. Like, Olimar just told this poor Pikmin to do something, and then the Pikmin killed itself by accident. Like, sure, it was an accident, but considering that these Pikmin were likened to kids, I don't know, man, what does that tell you? And that's not the only time Pikmin 1 allows itself to get dark. Pikmin 1 is told from a first person perspective, meaning that we get all of Olimar's first hand accounts of what's happening. He comments on the ship parts he finds during the day, and he has a moment of reflection at night in his captain's log, which is effectively his journal. Mind you, that the journal entries could very well be the last few things he writes because he'll suffocate to death, marooned on this planet. You get a real good look at the man that is Olimar playing through this game and reading all this stuff. Pikmin 1 gets at its darkest when you accidentally kill all of your Pikmin that you have. The day immediately ends, obviously, right? You just killed all your Pikmin. And it's in Olimer's captain's log where we get another delicious bit of that dark story candy. He talks about how he's a failure as a captain and how he doesn't know how he'll be able to get back home, and alludes to how his guilt won't be able to let him get any sleep at night. My nerd just wrote that he knows he's going to die soon and there's nothing he can do about it. You just read a journal entry of a dying man who thinks he's condemned, which is just juxtaposed by how colorful the world is. It's so bright, like even the blurbs are brightly lit. Like no creature is hiding, really. They're just kind of hanging out because they live here. I know the snake birds hide on the ground, but that's more like a jump scare. I mean, you can run away and nothing really happens. This game kind of reminds me a lot of Subnautica in a way. It almost has the exact same theme. A space dude crash lands onto a planet. You need to navigate this colorful planet filled with life to get whatever it is that you need to build a spaceship and escape. This game has a lot in common with Subnautica, and that game was a huge hit. Like, I honestly don't know why Pikmin isn't talked about more. A real kicker for some people was that at the end of the story, in the good ending, you get to see a load of different colored onions flying high on the planet as you leave. I don't know if this was to tease new future Pikmin, or as just like a throwaway cutscene that ended up shooting Nintendo in the foot. Whichever the case, I think it's safe to say that this one screen inspired so many people to imagine and create videos on YouTube about how their fan made Pikmin would work in this world. This takes us to the second topic I want to discuss, which is the Pikmin themselves. Pikmin 1 has the most Pikmin character out of all the other Pikmin in the games. And by character, I mean they do stuff themselves to feel like little creatures. I don't know if you ever tried to manage a team of like 4 or 5 people. It's hard to get everyone on the same page. Increase that to 100, and you can see why these Pikmin have little attention spans. Take, for example, walking. Walking can be a bit of a nuisance in Pikmin 1 because of how the Pikmin follow you. They fan out behind you. I think this was done so that you can feel the might of 100 Pikmin behind you. But this makes it difficult to cross bridges over water because you might clip some of the Pikmin and they'll end up drowning by accident. Or even when you're just straight up walking on safe ground, every now and then a little Pikmin might trip and fall, stunning them in a little animation for a little bit as it gets itself up, forcing the player who suffers from OCD to have to sit and wait if you don't want to leave any of your Pikmin behind. I can't imagine normies who play this game getting really mad at this kind of charm. The only people I really hear complain about the Pikmin tripping are the ones going for no death runs or super optimized people trying to min max everything for a world record. This kind of RNG is fine in my opinion because it's a game first and a competitive platform second. The Pikmin aren't little soldiers. They're as curious as children. They don't know anything about the world. They were barely born like a day or two ago. And you want them to follow you around like little loyal soldiers? That doesn't fit the setting. What I loved, and I'll admit, what annoyed me the most is when they start to straight up do stuff on their own without me. If you walk over a patch of grass that gives nectar, there's Pikmin in your ranks who will go AWOL for a hit of that nectar. Or what about when you're just standing around, kind of planning out your next move? Some Pikmin just straight up start taking stuff back home. I was so impressed slash offended by this. Like, yeah, okay, it makes sense that they'll want to keep busy. They have lives. But at the same time, it was almost like the game said, you were taking too long, so we decided to play instead. Like, nerds, I got this. Probably the most frustrating of all is when you're on a no death run and a Pikmin trips and gets eaten while you're being chased by an enemy. Like, on one hand, a nerd, it makes sense that the Pikmin might trip. Most were born literally today. They're not walking experts. But on the other hand, this is a game about paths and min maxing your day. Why include random RNG mechanics that actively make it harder to min max in a game about min maxing? Personally, the jury is still out. I don't really feel that strongly for or against this. It's natural and it makes sense. What I do know is what the loud people in the community feel and how Nintendo feels about it by how they handled this mechanic in later games. We'll compare them when we get to them. One thing that I absolutely loved was when you send these Pikmin to pick up this particular treasure all high up. I remember thinking, dang, that's really high up. And then watching as they sort of just fall into the ground with the treasure. And I was like, oh, snap, okay, yeah, like, that was kind of dangerous. I don't know what I was expecting. And watching as these little Pikmin dust themselves off and try to carry the treasure back anyways. It's these little moments that, although not min-max friendly, do add a lot to the character of the Pikmin. And in my opinion, are absolutely necessary to making people care about their Pikmin. The last thing I want to talk about is how new all the Pikmin are. Pikmin 1 is the only game that has an entirely new cast of Pikmin for us to play with. I mean, sure, Pikmin 2 and 3 have a wider variety of Pikmin to choose from, but more than half of those Pikmin are recycled Pikmin from Pikmin 1. And this is what I mean by Nintendo shooting themselves in the foot. You can't tease all your fans about potentially loads of wild Pikmin out there and then still give me the same three main types. Like, I get it. At the end of the day, Nintendo's still a business, and it's very obvious that they want these three main types to be mascots of the franchise. I just disagree with this decision. The final piece I want to talk about with Pikmin 1 is the day cycle. The day cycle does a lot in this game. It gives the player time to breathe between play sessions. It gives the player a real stopping point in case they need to step away. It also facilitates Olimer's thoughts to be naturally woven into the game as daily captain's logs. But I think the most important is that the day cycle gives the game tension. By tension, I mean it motivates the player to complete their tasks because they can lose the game. This game always kind of reminded me of like a school project. It's due in like 30 days, and the teacher lies to you by telling you that you can't do it all in one night. Pikmin is different because you most certainly can't do it all in one in game day. You're forced to respect the 30-day limit. There's no extra days hiding anywhere. Plus, it's always looming over you, with each day advancing the day counter. And Olimer sprinkles in here and there that it exists and it's meant to motivate you, which I think it does its job. The reason the day cycle is a big deal is because so much of the game feels like it was designed around the day cycle in mind. The captain's logs would feel out of place or shoehorned in without the day cycle to give them proper meaning. The levels have to be designed in such a way that tasks can be accomplished within a day. And by tasks, I mean the player should be able to go out and collect at least one piece of treasure within a day. The enemy designs also appear to be affected by this. I always kind of wondered why the blurbs were so easy to beat since they're kind of framed as the main natural predator of the Pikmin. Even the final trial has the Emperor Bullblacks be a Bulborb, so these guys feel like the main threats, right? And even the final cutscene in the game's good ending has Pikmin jump on a Bulborb, and at night no less. So it's clear that the Bulborbs represent something, and with all of these symbols of the Bulborb's importance, why is it that they're so easy to kill during the day? Like, look how easy it is to kill a giant nerd. Like, this only makes sense to me if, sure, this is a game, and also the player needs to be able to dispatch enemies quickly in order to make significant progress in a day, which translates to the player needs to be able to quickly deal with any small obstacle so that they can collect the treasure by the end of the day. This is what I mean when I say that the day cycle influences everything, from the narrative to the level design to the enemy design. And it's a big part of what makes Pikmin 1 special. As a final nail in the coffin, take a look at how bosses are designed. They're not like Pikmin 3 bosses, where the damage done to them in one day is rolled over to the next. No. These bosses have to be beaten in a day in order for them to count. Otherwise, you'll have to come back the next day with the boss at full health. They were designed to be beatable in a day, which is why I don't think it's a stretch to say that the day cycle in Pikmin 1 rules over everything. Now that we're done talking about Pikmin 1's story, the Pikmin themselves, and the day cycle, let's take a look at Pikmin 2. From a story perspective, Pikmin 2 is almost as opposite as it gets. Where Pikmin 1 allows you to get a good look at who Olimer is as a person, Pikmin 2 has almost all of its exposition narrated by the new spaceship companion that comes along. Even though in this game you have Olimer and Louis as playable characters, and also the president becomes playable in the second half of the game, they don't get to say much. And that's a shame because there's three people who remain silent throughout the duration of the game that have to take a back seat so that the spaceship can do all the talking. And you might argue that, yeah, the president has some exposition in his nightly emails, but I counter argue by saying that those emails are external to what is currently happening on the planet. His emails are about the company in general, not about how he views the Pikmin as a species or how their interactions with him affect him on a personal level. So the narration is kind of limited to just the spaceship yelling at us about how to play the game, and how Oliver should be teaching all of these things to Louis, which conveniently also teaches us if you're a new player. This change in perspective is not the main issue I want to discuss. It's the fact that Pikmin 2 doesn't allow itself to get nearly as dark as Pikmin 1 did. So let's go briefly through the story, in case you need a refresher. And then we can talk about the missing elements with everyone on the same page. Pikmin 2 starts off right after the events of Pikmin 1. Oliver comes back home only to be told by the company president that they are in some serious debt. Upon hearing the news, the spaceship sucks in Oliver's treasure and determines it has value. Then the president of the company decides to send out Oliver and Louis back to PNF 404 so that they can collect a bunch of treasure and pay off the debt. Although it's framed like the goal of the game, it's actually just the first half of the game. After you collect enough treasure to pay back the debts, on your return trip back home, Oliver accidentally leaves Louis behind, and the company president and Oliver have to come back to this planet to find him. This game does have a bit of mystery surrounding Louis, and a YouTuber named Das created a YouTube video about Pikmin and the Umibozu that I totally buy. What I'm trying to say is that I'm not against the story in Pikmin 2. What I am against is that it doesn't get as dark as Pikmin 1. It might allow itself to get more mysterious than Pikmin 1, but not dark. For starters, the Pikmin are not described as childlike in the main narrative. The spaceship just sort of mentions that Oliver talked about them in the logs and nothing more. Pikmin 2 doesn't have a bomb rock picking up mechanic where the Pikmin can pick up bomb rocks. So there's no chance for a dialogue on the dangers of bomb rocks or scared little Pikmin that accidentally blow themselves up. Can you see how the game is moving away from its darker roots? The prime example for me of how Pikmin 2 has moved away completely from Pikmin 1's darker themes is in how it handles a Pikmin extinction. For those who don't know, Pikmin 2's Pikmin extinction has the day immediately end, with the night email mentioning nothing about the Pikmin extinction, and having the next day start with a ship telling you about how precious and rare these lone one Pikmin are to the species, and how you should take better care of them. Arguably, this sad moment of an extinction was probably only witnessed genuinely by kids or inexperienced players. So I can definitely understand why Nintendo decided to move away from Oliver's initial reactions of, I'm the worst, I'm basically dead, I can't sleep at night because of the shame and guilt, to something a little bit more positive for younger players enjoying the game. Mistakes happen, and especially for inexperienced players, they need to be allowed to explore their mistakes in a positive manner. So, although I agree with Nintendo's position with this new style of dealing with Pikmin's darker themes, at the end of the day, Nintendo is still walking away from the darker themes that make Pikmin 1 so special, in my opinion. Without getting too ahead of myself, Pikmin 3 does have a Doomsday vibe to it, but it doesn't get anywhere near as dark as Pikmin 1. So, I hope it's becoming clear that, at least at this point in the video, that Nintendo is never going to go back to Pikmin 1's darker themes again. So with the darker themes a thing of the past in Pikmin 2, let's talk about the Pikmin themselves in this game. Pikmin 2 has the most variety to offer in any of the games currently out at the time of this video. It holds a total of 6 Pikmin types, the 3 original colors, and the new ones of purple, white, and cave-dwelling bulbmin. On one hand, I think these are great. It expands on the Pikmin promise made to us in Pikmin 1, and they're strange enough to satisfy at least me as a player. I don't, however, agree with the returning Pikmin as part of this game. I understand that they're supposed to be Nintendo's Pikmin mascots, but seeing as how Pikmin 1 had a whole new cast of Pikmin, arguably by default because it was the first game in the series, so everything is new, but I think it still counts that they're all new Pikmin. The fact that Nintendo spent the effort to make 3 new Pikmin types in this game and include the old ones, I don't know, man, I'm still on the fence, but I'm glad for the variety. I just personally feel like a new cast of Pikmin would have been better. The other thing that you see less of is in the character the Pikmin display while playing. Their autonomy got toned down a lot more in Pikmin 2. The Pikmin trip a lot less. From a game design perspective, I can see why this change was made. It's less annoying for players trying to min-max their days, or for casual OCD players who wait for each little Pikmin to go with them. I'm a bit against this though because of the amount of character that was on display in Pikmin 1. They're little creatures, not soldiers. So although it's annoying to some, I strongly believe these displays of characters have a place in the game. I also don't remember seeing the Pikmin fall down from a really high place in Pikmin 2, which, you know, I thought it was hilarious and I really missed that. At this point in the video, I hope it's clear that Nintendo is moving away from giving Pikmin too much character within the game itself. Pikmin 2 has cutscenes when introducing each Pikmin, so technically the character bits are still included in the game, but I'm arguing that they should be part of the gameplay itself so that they can be felt by the player. Pikmin 2 does have one shining moment that always makes me laugh when it happens. In the game, there's these eggs that sometimes appear that can have like nectar inside. But every now and then, you're surprised by these creepy little critters that make your Pikmin just completely freak out. They run around and like panic while you're trying to get them in line. And like these creatures aren't dangerous, right? Like I don't think I've ever seen them hurt any of my Pikmin. But it's absolutely adorable how like these Pikmin freak out for no reason. Although this does happen in the game, I still feel they've toned down some of the more regular mechanics that give Pikmin character when you take the entire game as a whole, which I think goes against the spirit of the game of making you care about these Pikmin. So we've talked about the story, and we've talked about the Pikmin. We can now take a look at how the day cycle is handled in Pikmin 2. If you've played Pikmin 2, then you'll know that the day cycle is just sort of included in the game because I don't know why. The day cycle still sort of functions, but since the player will be spending most of their time exploring caves, and time doesn't move forward in caves, and caves can take around like an hour and 30 minutes to fully explore, it's super jarring to come back out of a cave to see the sun in full display still, and having more than half of the day left to work with. I'm grateful for the extra content that the caves provide, but it's at the expense of the day cycle's importance. The explorable areas don't feel like genuine areas in this game, at least to me. They work and feel more like explorable hub areas for the player to move around in between cave explorations. This change in Pikmin 2 was rather jarring for me because the day cycle felt like part of Pikmin 1's identity. And to have that just take a complete backseat and be almost irrelevant in Pikmin 2 feels super out of place. It's almost like Nintendo understood this and the limitations that came with it, and Nintendo chose to make it as relevant as possible in Pikmin 2 to give the game space for creative freedom and the option of choosing when to make the day cycle a thing and when to save content for the caves. Regardless of whether my reasoning is correct or not, the day cycle to me was a big part of what made Pikmin 1 so special. And to see it take such a back seat in Pikmin 2, in my opinion, feels off. I wouldn't call it a mistake because I love the extra content. It just doesn't feel like what Pikmin 1 is all about, which is the argument I'm trying to make with this comparison. Pikmin 2 is a good game in its own right. It expanded on the Pikmin variety in meaningful ways, and it had a lot of content to offer, not to mention the challenge levels and the multiplayer mode. It's clear that Nintendo was experimenting with the Pikmin formula, and it got a result that I'm not entirely convinced that they were happy with, and the evidence I used to make that determination is in how Pikmin 3 is handled. So let's take a look at Pikmin 3 and how they handle story, the Pikmin themselves, and the day cycle to see how true they keep to the original of Pikmin 1. We'll start with the story. As a quick refresher, Pikmin 3's story is about a planet named Kopai that is on the verge of starvation. They sent out probes to look for food on other planets and came upon PNF 404. They sent a team of astronauts to go to this planet and look for food so that Kopai won't starve. And depending on whether or not you collect enough fruit determines whether or not you succeed. When they arrive on PNF 404, the ship malfunctions and they all get separated. When they reunite, it's then revealed that the Kopashians also need to find their cosmic drive key on top of collecting fruit in order to go back home because their ship's return to trip function won't work without it. The astronauts only brought a 3-day supply of juice as food, and you'll need to be collecting fruit to juice down for food so that you can buy yourself more time to collect more fruit and find the cosmic drive key to get back home. It's fair to say that the story is dark and along the same lines as Pikmin 1, but this alone is the setting that the Kopashians are in. The narrative in the game doesn't add much. For example, when they discover the Pikmin, they don't really describe the Pikmin as childlike. They just mention that they're creatures. The captains themselves don't really talk about how they're affected by the Pikmin. just that they need to take care of the Pikmin so that they can use them to collect the food they need to survive. Even the nightly captain's logs doesn't really mention how they're affected by the Pikmin. The captains just take turns either talking about their mission, what they need to focus on as like a reminder to the player, or properties of the Pikmin. It's never their personal thoughts about them saving their planets and the pressure they feel, or talk about what life was like back home on Kopai. At least, not on my playthrough. It's this decision to make the captains focus on the goal of the game rather than the journey that they're on that made the captains feel a little bit hollow to me. And I don't want to downplay their character. These little captains have a lot of character woven into them. Brittany is sometimes brutal, Alf is as close to a standard hero in this game as we get, and Charlie feels like he fumbles as a leader while still being a bit egocentric. It's fine for kids because their personalities are cartoony, but it lacks the development Pikmin 1 brought to the table. And I realized this because they don't talk about themselves. They only repeat over and over that they're here on this planet to collect fruit and that they need the cosmic drive key to get back home. To be fair, there are two moments that stood out to me that I believe are worth mentioning. The first is when you discover the blue Pikmin, and the second is when you kill a bunch of your Pikmin. In Pikmin 3, you get your 5 Pikmin types, kind of like Pikmin 2. The main difference is that they all now share an onion, making it easier for the player to manage. Each time you discover a Pikmin type, the onions fuse together and the resulting onion is slightly bigger. When you discover all of the Pikmin in the game, the final one being the blue Pikmin, the onion gets so big that it's as big as the Drake's spaceship. And the Copatians verbally wonder if the big onion would try to fuse and swallow up the Drake as well. On the surface, this looks like Pikmin 3 still has some mysteries. But on the other hand, this is just an open ended question. They don't elaborate on how maybe they shouldn't be messing with Pikmin because they don't fully understand what they're doing or what they're all about. A natural question one might ask if you're worried that the onion might swallow your ship. Instead of that, the characters just stay silent and the game continues like they didn't just consider the onion a threat. The second moment that stood out to me is that you can carry bomb rocks in this game again. So I figured there's gotta be some dialogue about how dangerous they are, right? Well, nothing happened. So I had to resort to killing a bunch of my Pikmin to try to trigger it, uh, which was hard, for me to do, not gonna lie. And you get this weird interaction. The captain's logs that I got was from Charlie, who commented on how these things happen and that we need to move on. Something that I thought was rather cold. And then the next day, the Copatians chit chat about how it's the captain's fault and it's played up for laughs. This was okay, and at the same time, not okay in my opinion. Okay in the sense that I understand that kids will be playing this game, and we can't tell them, dude, you just murdered a bunch of your Pikmin, and the characters blame themselves. So I understand why this was omitted. But at the same time, I think it's not okay because it's devaluing the lives of the Pikmin. More in this game than any other game do I feel like the Pikmin are treated as tools and not as creatures that interact with you for mutual help. Pikmin 1 ended with the cutscene of them fighting a Bulborb at night. A giant Bulborb that eats Pikmin at night when they're the most dangerous. So you can piece together that the Pikmin were learning from you. In Pikmin 3, the ending is just them watching you leave, and that's it. Like good little soldiers still waiting for you to tell them what to do. In fact, we should start talking about the Pikmin themselves in Pikmin 3. The Pikmin in Pikmin 3, I believe, are at their worst in this game. They follow you in a straight line like good little soldiers, and they uncomfortably stare at the captains like they're the most interesting thing on this planet, which I don't buy. Like, they were just born yesterday. I just plucked them out of the ground, and everything is new. How am I the most interesting thing here? In Pikmin 1, the little Pikmin would look around every now and then, and they'd be slightly distracted at times. But here, they're laser focused on what you do and say. They no longer trip, which I just disagree with. And while this makes sense from a game design perspective that wants to give full control to the players, it makes less sense when you want the player to feel like they're in an alien world in charge of little critters that have lives of their own. To top it off, the little ammonites that scared the Pikmin are gone and don't appear in Pikmin 3, which I missed a lot. I just don't really like how the Pikmin are portrayed in this game. The other aspect I want to talk about, which may be controversial, is that, in my humble opinion, all the Pikmin in Pikmin 3 are not new at all. They're just refined versions of Pikmin 2's Pikmin. Here's what I mean. Pikmin 2 had the three main types of Pikmin that also appear in Pikmin 3, along with the purple, white, and bulbmin Pikmin. Since bulbmin were used more as like a crutch to aid the players when they're down in caves and have taken losses, these bulbmin were there to replenish Pikmin's supply. And in my opinion, this fits nicely as to why they're immune to every hazard and why you're not allowed to bring them above ground. So bulbmin were more sprinkled in as needed and not really a Pikmin to be used in general. I think that's why they remain in Pikmin 2. So that takes care of Bulbmin. The rock Pikmin are just refined versions of the purple Pikmin. The math I did was that the purple Pikmin were meant to solve the problem of carrying treasure back to base, but the designers also made them slow, which made them a bit unusable when the day is close to ending. And also because these Pikmin have a much better utility in combat than in carrying items back to base. In combat, when thrown, these Pikmin can stun lock an enemy when they land, which is super helpful when you're trying to kill a bunch of enemies as you go through exploring the level. So, and remember, this is just my speculation. What Nintendo did was that they removed their semi-useful feature of carrying items back to base because, people weren't using them in that way anyways. And they removed their slow mechanic because that was more annoying in the game than any interesting scenario that can get created with this mechanic. And they tuned their stun lock ability that can feel broken at times to something that deals more damage than a regular Pikmin attack when thrown, which is arguably the most satisfying thing to do in the game. These changes is why I say the rock Pikmin are just refined versions of the purple Pikmin, and making them look like rocks makes it incredibly intuitive to players as to how they're supposed to be used. The first time I saw rock Pikmin, I thought they were cool, sure, but they felt super familiar to me. And until I did this math, then they stopped feeling new to me at all. I encourage you to check my math. Again, this is just my humble reasoning. I'm not a game designer by any means. The pink Pikmin, to me, feel like refined versions of the white Pikmin, and I'll explain my math as well. The white Pikmin introduced the poison hazard mechanic. They could see buried treasure, had a poisoning revenge mechanic when eaten, and they could run treasure back the quickest. I don't know how the designers feel about the poison hazard, but it doesn't make a return in Pikmin 3. So, arguably, it was only used as a lock and key mechanic given that certain walls could only be broken down by white Pikmin. So, I don't know. I'm just going to put this aside. Being the only Pikmin to see buried treasure might have been seen as more annoying than useful, given that you'd need at least one Pikmin in your ranks when sweeping caves. Otherwise, you'd have to come back with some white Pikmin to make sure that you've gotten all the treasure. I had a few scenarios where I had one lone white Pikmin that I had to protect like he was the president. Because if he died, I'd have to go back out and generate more white Pikmin just so that I could come back and finish sweeping the cave. That's not fun. That's annoying. The revenge mechanic of poisoning enemies when being eaten, I believe, goes against the spirit of not killing your Pikmin for whatever reason. So I can see how this got axed. The only remaining usefulness the white Pikmin have is in how fast they can run treasure back to your base. It's my personal opinion that the designers of Pikmin saw that it might not have been intuitive enough in Pikmin 2 that the white Pikmin are the quickest, because the mechanic kind of gets drowned out by the other perks these nerds have. So to fix this, they made pink winged Pikmin that function almost exclusively on speed. And that perk is incredibly intuitive because when they carry stuff, they just straight up fly over everything. So it makes sense that they'll get the fruit the quickest because they could just fly over the map. Again, feel free to check my math. That's the answer that I got. And I don't have the teacher's edition to check my answer in the back. So, it's just my opinion. So because of this, I argue that Pikmin 3 doesn't have any new novel Pikmin for us to play with. They're just reskinned, polished versions of Pikmin 2's Pikmin, and I think the game is a bit disappointing in that respect. Pikmin 1 went from a whole new cast of Pikmin by default, but I mean, it's still a new cast of Pikmin, to Pikmin 3 arguably just having polished, refined versions of Pikmin 2's Pikmin. So, having talked about the story and the Pikmin themselves, let's take a look at the day cycle. Pikmin 3 does a good job of giving the day cycle meaning again because of the juice mechanic. As a quick refresher, every day the player spends on the planet also consumes a juice from the fridge. You can generate more juice by collecting fruit, which is also necessary to save Kopai. The game ends if you run out of juice with a small cutscene of all the captains sad in their ship, alluding that they starved to death, which is actually pretty dark. This is a fantastic way to give the day cycle meaning. In Pikmin 1, you had 30 days, so it felt very much sink or swim. And although experienced players never really felt the sting of not completing the game in those 30 days, I bet a lot of inexperienced players did, which is not an emotion you'll want those players to have. So, although the tension of the 30 days is always present, it isn't really felt by the entire range of players from the perspective of the skill range players have. Introducing the juice mechanic allows that tension to be managed as a resource. Inexperienced players could always go back and collect more fruits to pad out their days. I hear experienced players comment on how the juice mechanic didn't really affect them, and I think it's because they didn't understand that the day cycle as a whole never really affected them either, and that the day cycle isn't really meant for them. It's for kids. And allowing the day cycle to be managed as a resource, kids can really feel the tension the day cycle brings in a relatively safe environment, and allow more experienced players the freedom to min max their days as they like. I agree with this change. I just feel like tension was never really solved in any of the Pikmin games. Tension can feel oppressive to new players in all Pikmin games, and I think that's backwards. The tension should be better suited for experienced players, and new players should get a more casual playthrough. In other words, the game should get harder if you're good at the game, and easier if you're new. To be completely open and honest, I haven't tried the ultra spicy mode, so I can't really comment on how hard that is, or how that game mode brings tension to the table. Maybe it's good, I don't know, I need to give it a go. Again, I do want to comment that I enjoyed Pikmin 3. Olimer showing up and being part of the story was fun, and it was really nice collecting fruit because, dude, they look delicious. It's just not Pikmin 1. I mean, Pikmin 1 content is so rare that I'll eat it up even if I disagree with the direction Nintendo has taken the franchise in. The frustrating part for me is that I know Nintendo won't make another Pikmin 1 game because it doesn't fit in their business model. Analyzing this game made me stumble upon two ideas for designing games. I named one mascotish games and the other formulaic games. I made these terms up, so please don't Google them. Mascotish games are games where it's designed to be injectable with mascots. Nintendo makes the most of this kind of game because they can effectively inject any mascot in their games and have it work. They just usually tend to inject Mario. Creating mascots of their franchises is Nintendo's main business model, so making games that lean on this goal is to their benefit. However, Pikmin 1 wasn't created as a mascotish game. It's more of a formulaic game. Formulaic games are games that rely on formula and less on mascots. I know this sounds super vague, so I'll give you an example. When I think of mascotish games, I think of Mario. Mario Tennis is a mascotish game because it could be Zelda Tennis and it would still work. Probably the best example is the Super Smash Bros. Series, where they can literally inject any character into that fighting game. When I think of formulaic games, on the other hand, I tend to think of Grand Theft Auto or the Final Fantasy series, specifically 1 through 10. Grand Theft Auto is a game that relies on its formula of being an open world game where the player can pretend to be a gangster, and this formula remains largely unchanged in the subsequent games. From GTA 3 to GTA 5, they expand on this gangster theme and open world. The same is with Final Fantasy. The RPG elements are roughly the same, with XP being earned, random encounters, and a leveling up system that remains largely unchanged. One main property of formulaic games is that their characters are allowed and encouraged to go through character development, while mascotish games do not. Mascotish games don't promote character development because it's much easier to reuse a character that has experienced very little growth in a sequel or a spin off title than it is, for example, to bring a gangster who went from nothing to Kingpin back for a sequel. And it's this property of formulaic games that makes studios like Rockstar create sequels with an entirely new cast of characters and world. GTA 5 has different people from GTA 4 and 3. Also, I don't think any of the Final Fantasy characters return, but I'm not heavy into RPGs, so don't quote me on that. And it's this main distinction that makes Pikmin 1 so special to me. Oliver experiences character development. He lands, he thinks he'll die, he discovers and learns from Pikmin. The Pikmin affect him at a personal level, and he thinks about them, he studies them, and he thinks about his family a lot. And then he finally makes it back home, completing his story. Then, when it came time to make a sequel, Nintendo had to realize that they kind of shot themselves in the foot. I'm still not entirely sure if they're aware of the distinction between mascotish games and formulaic games, but they definitely realized that they needed to move Olimar to be more of a mascot in the sequel. Which is why in Pikmin 2, they completely ignored the heavy emotional story beats that occurred in Pikmin 1 and only mentioned that Olimar had been there before. It's this reason that I know Nintendo will never make a true successor to Pikmin 1, because they create mascotish games, not formulaic games. A true Pikmin sequel wouldn't include Olimar as a playable character. This is why Pikmin 3 gave me hope by bringing in 3 new captains. Pikmin 3 has a whole new cast and a day cycle, but they missed the mark with the character development, how dark the story can get, and how they handled Pikmin in general. Personally, Pikmin 3 was a little bit of a letdown because I expected a sequel to Pikmin 1. In my opinion, a true Pikmin successor needs to have the following. 1. It needs a new character or characters to visit PNF 404 under similar dire circumstances as Olimar. The spaceship hits another asteroid or something, it doesn't really matter. They just need to land somewhere completely new. It could be an entire game dedicated to them in ice, jungle, dark caves with a little sun. The point is that the characters and the setting have to be distinct. 2. It needs to have real character development. Whoever we control needs to be affected by the Pikmin around them like Olimar did, and this development must be allowed to explore darker themes of the Pikmin world. It could explore, environmental impacts, like how Pikmin can clear a level of living creatures, leaving little alive left behind. You can explore pacifism by working mechanics revolving around not killing anything. Whichever the case is, the game must be allowed to get dark and explore these themes in a respectable manner. Nothing in your face about it, but definitely present. 3. The Pikmin need to have their character be part of the gameplay. They don't need to trip, but they do need to sing, look around, do things on their own. They should be hard to control because they're not little soldiers. 4. The day cycle needs to be part of the game's story and game design, and preferably create tension for experienced players while simultaneously give a casual experience to new players. This is difficult, so I don't expect this to actually work, but preferably this is the goal. And lastly, and most importantly, 5. The Pikmin we find must be completely new. Maybe one, two tops returning Pikmin from previous games, but they must be mostly new. I think these elements are critical in making a true Pikmin 1 successor, one that respects the spirit of the original game and expands upon it. As I said at the start of the video, Pikmin 1 is a franchise that's very near and dear to my heart. I've spent close to half a year working on this video to make sure I capture my points correctly. I'm uploading these thoughts to add to the community and the game that I love so much. I spent so much time thinking about this topic that it actually spawned off 3 other videos that were entire topics themselves that I wanted to put in this video, but couldn't because the video would lose focus, and I'm talking about 4 different subjects that do touch on Pikmin but can't be considered their own thing. The links are in the description if you're interested. One video goes into detail about Pikmin's game design. Another goes into detail about the definition of a mascotish game and a formulaic game and their properties. And the last one is about how video games have taught me to name ideas and concepts to make them easier to work with. As always, this video is the start of a discussion. Do you agree with me on Pikmin 1 having no true successor? What would your true Pikmin 1 successor need to have to be considered one? Did my points about dark story, the Pikmin, the day cycle make sense? Or am I just super off the mark? Pikmin on the Wii was way easier. I tried playing on the GameCube version, and I'm not gonna lie, it's not the same. I did it, but it was I missed it. I missed the pointer and being able to select my Pikmin with like a button. That's it for now, and I'll see you guys next time.